dogs at the end of the Iditarod that had more energy than Tony did at the airport today. That's what I'm saying.
Did you see Tony?
I mean, he was like, where were you guys poloing from? Was it that at the airport? Was it the hotel lobby? Where was it? The hotel lobby?
Everyone.
We know that. This is important. Where were you poloing from?
That was the mall.
I didn't polo. I ran out of data. I kept falling asleep in the airport today. Like, I had a lot of airport drama getting home. My bag somehow made it home before I did today. And I don't know how that was possible. So I
think you got put on an earlier flight, April.
Why did I get put on an earlier flight?
Because they liked your bag more?
And we're live!
We've been live for like 2 minutes.
Oh my God, I had no idea.
Totally new.
Oh, we're so surprised.
Hey everyone, we're exhausted. We had an amazing weekend in Denver. Everyone but Chris. We didn't take Chris.
Go.
If you stumbled in, we're so excited to see you, especially if you're one of our new fans from Denver and you're joining us now at hashtag SPSM. SPSM is the suicide prevention social media chat. We are so thrilled to have you here. I am at Doc Foreman. We got to hang out together and talk about SPSM, and we had some lessons learned while we were in Denver that we're going to be talking about Elevate the Convo today, and about this wonderful event that they've now had for 5 years in Denver. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the questions, some of the things that we think we already, I don't know if they already knew, but it's definitely some lessons learned about what kinds of information about suicide and social media people want and are not getting. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when Bart and I speak together for 6 hours straight. Bart, are you turning red?
No, what? I don't understand. If I talked for 6 hours straight?
We talked for 6 hours straight.
Some of us talked for 6 hours straight. Some of us stayed on our marks and stayed within our time limits. And some of us tried really hard.
But before we get to that, everybody say hello to Mr. Tony Wood. Tony, say hi to the people.
Hey everybody, I'm Tony Wood at ADWWW on Twitter. I am the CEO of Quantify, and we're a software company. We do some stuff. There's also ourdatahelps.org, ourdatahelps.org. Donate your data today. I'm also the chair of the board of the American Association of Suicidology, suicidology.org. We have a conference coming up, but I think that our communications director, Christopher Maxwell, can tell us more about that.
Before we do that, Tony, I have a question. Wait, Tony, I have a question. What's the thing called? What's the thing called? This is April. This is important. This is a matter of fact. We need Tony. What do they call it?
Chris?
Tony? What do they call
Dad?
it?
What do we call it?
Ready? All right. When someone takes you against your will and it holds you for 6 to 8 hours and you can't leave, but you want to leave, we have a term for that. It's called
kidnapping or a hostage situation.
Kidnapping. Yeah, but it could be hostage and kidnapping. Most hostage situations are, I think, de facto kidnapping situations. Could we agree with that?
Agreed. What is kidnapping?
What if you're a friendly hostage? I don't know.
You were kind of like the Limburg baby that survived this weekend, Tony. That's what I've been.
Your children's hostage.
That turned out okay. No, it really didn't. But it's not. I mean, that's I don't think it's too soon for that.
You know, you're gracious. You've been the recipient of felony assault in many ways, and you forgive.
I think you need to explain this to the peoples, Bart.
What the peoples don't know is that you kept Tony against his will forever. Tony, how long was it? Like 14
hours?
It was his
birthday.
I'm not sure that I feel safe quite yet.
Is it birthday?
She was sending hostage videos of him trying to ask for help as this was happening.
The last text I got from Tony is, "I'm not getting out of here alive," and that's when.
God, don't do that.
But I did survive.
Wow. Oh, sorry.
And we hung out with a lot of SPSMers. So
did.
Big shout outs to like Jess Tillman Rainey and to Heidi and to Nathan and who else? How many people did we run?
Was Stacy there?
Stacy Fried. No, she was in Houston.
She was in Houston.
And then I was freaking out because of a tweet that somehow Stacy and Bart hooked up, and I was very unclear.
Yeah, you hung out with everybody, but who didn't you actually hang out with, Tony and April?
I
Me.
tried to hang out with you.
No, you no.
I didn't know. I asked Tony if it was time to go, and he's like, "We can sit here forever."
I've heard this story, and that's what it is. Are you being coy with me, April Foreman?
I'm always being coy. Let's do just so we haven't finished introducing everybody. First of all, I want to give Bart some love about Groovy Little Crisis Center because that got some play on stage.
It is pretty groovy.
It is groovy. Feeling groovy. Right?
Oh, Dad are fighting again. Mom is Bart Andrews and Dad is Tony. Now that I love.
Oh, that is so adorable. Yeah, I mean, the conference was fun. The format of the conference was amazing. I enjoyed myself. I'm Dr. Bart Andrews. I'm from Behavioral Health Response, a groovy little crisis center in St. Louis, Missouri. And if you're trying to reach me on Twitter, you can reach me at Bart Andrews. My real name is my Twitter handle, a rare treat in this day and age of Twitterdom. And we have a lot of stuff to talk about, but we never did get to introduce Chris because Chris didn't get to speak because we had to cover Tony's kidnapping.
You interrupted.
Yes, I did, because I wanted to make sure that the whole audience knew that Tony was, in fact, the victim of kidnapping over the weekend on his birthday.
It's good to have that on record, I think.
I think so.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Maxwell. I'm Communications Coordinator for American Association of Suicidology. As Tony mentioned, we have a conference coming up in April. It's April 18th through 21st. It is a pretty rockin' conference, I must say. We have tons and tons and tons of things going on. We have thought leader sessions and TED style talks. We have like over 200 individual breakout sessions. So this year is going to be huge. If you are interested in suicide prevention, suicidology at all, this is the conference to be at. Great networking as well. It's where I hang out with these fine people.
Woo! And Stack Up's going to be there.
And Stack Up is going to be there, our guest from last week. And so you can go and register for the conference at suicidology.org. You can also find out information about hotel overflow and all that kind of fun stuff too. So go check it out.
Fantastic. Oh my God, that's amazing. And Chris has been doing, like, we've had graphic updates and all sorts of other things. And we just have all sorts of cool stuff planned. It's just, you know, like every year gets bigger and better, which is amazing. And Bart Andrews finished with Groovy.
Well, what is the grooviness I'm finishing? Give me some, what's the setup on this?
They're doing like Paul Simon lyrics about feeling groovy because you're Groovy Little Crisis Center.
Oh, yeah, that's a good song, by the way. What is that, the 59th Street Bridge? What's the name of that song,
It's called
Tony?
59th Street Bridge song. Yes, I do know that song.
See, I knew one of you would know it, right? Because you're a big Paul Simon freak. That happened on Monk, by the way. Are you a Paul Simon or a Garfunkel? Right? That was part of that.
Paul Simon. Garfunkel with just a pretty voice, and it didn't last too long. The B movies didn't do him so good.
Actually, yeah, the Garfunkel, actually, to be a Garfunkel is kind of a dig. You don't ever always say that you're the Garfunkel. I felt like the Garfunkel at the conference, kind of, because at the conference, when we would finish peaking, everybody would rush up to the stage to speak to April, and I would be like, "Can I help you?" And they'd be like, "Oh, I want to talk to April." I'd be like, "Okay."
I really want to feel bad.
You totally were like running to the cab. You're like, "Bye," and I'm like, "Bart, where are you going? I have to go see my family." Like, I'm not your family.
I really want to feel bad for Bart, but at least he was there.
Oh, that's true.
Burn.
Ouch.
Burn.
Wow. Daddy Dog's getting hardcore with the digs.
Now we have some stuff to talk about some of the things that happened while we were there. And I want to talk a little bit about what we learned about Elevate the Convo. So first of all, I've never spoken in a venue with a grizzly bear before. That was pretty great.
Yep.
And I just want to give a shout out. The venue was really, really cool. It was the Wildlife Experience Center.
Yeah, it was.
Do I have that right?
Yeah.
I want to always speak with a stuffed bear. Always. Like, I feel like that is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. University of Colorado, South Denver campus is where we were.
Yes.
An amazing venue. The other thing that was really cool is for a large conference room like that, they had big windows that you could also close with a remote so that you didn't have sun. And when the sun moved away, then you could open up the windows. And actually to present in a big conference center where you actually had real sunlight was truly a treat, right? Usually you're locked in these rooms with no sunlight for 8 to 10 hours. And that was incredibly... Well, they were behind us. So we weren't facing the windows.
There's a little, something's happening with your mic.
Back there, Bart.
Sorry.
I love Chris going,
I was going to hold it together, and then I saw Tony's eyes, and I lost it.
Try again, Bart. Let's see if we can make your mic work.
Okay. Old Muppet face.
Try again, Bart.
Is it still doing it? Is it doing it?
No.
Okay. No, is it okay now?
You're okay now.
Mm-hmm.
Windows.
No, I'm afraid to say. I'm afraid we're going to get. So the windows are behind us. We had windows behind us.
When did you have time to look behind you?
Well, I kind of survey the entire environment. I find it's really good to be aware of yourself.
Did they open the windows behind us during the Q&A?
No, the windows got opened like right around lunch.
That was like right before the Q&A.
No.
There
was the brain call.
I think
There was the brain. Yeah, you're right. I think you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. Oh, you are.
So, interestingly enough, we got to talk a lot about SPSM, about how we got there, and we got to talk about some of the topics that we thought were important in suicide and social media, and also to answer audience questions, which was really interesting. And I also was really validated to have Tony and Bart there for once, because some of the things that have inspired some of our SPSM episodes happened again while we were Elevate the Convo. And so, I was asking Bart about what his top sort of comments were, or what his sort of major talking points were having done the experience. And I have a couple of my own. Bart, did you want to start off?
There were lots of things to comment on. I think that one of the things that really stuck out to me is that when you say suicide prevention in social media, that's a really general, large arena of content and possible things that you could talk about, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that one of the things that we learned, and just watching the thread while we were presenting, there's a great interest and a lot of people spending a lot of time wondering about how social media is connected to the suicide rate, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that was one of the things that we kind of adjusted our presentation on the fly to address some of that stuff. But I think one of the things, and this is one of the things that I'm really starting to recognize in general, is that there's a lot of information out there that's surface level information, and people kind of gobble up the headlines and maybe the first paragraph of things, and they kind of run with things, and then things are a lot more complicated than these really quick headlines or leads or lead paragraphs are. And so one of the things that really occurred to me is we really need to be having some really good conversations about how social media is connected to the suicide rate, given there's a couple of researchers out there, Twinge in particular, who is really believes that social media is increasing the suicide rate among young girls, and says that you should restrict social media and screen time to 2 hours. And that message, people like certainty. People really like things being cut and dry. They like to know that this is good, this is bad, and here's how you fix it. And we know that in suicide prevention, and we know that particularly in psychological research and social work and all these things, that things are rarely cut and dry in that fashion. And just like the data around the media's influence on suicide rates, there's an awful lot of people running around like there's these certain things that we know how this works. And I have bad news that we really don't know a lot about how some of these things work, but we know enough to know that they're rather complicated. Mm-hmm. But I do think that we need to have a really good talking points about social media and suicide, the good, the bad. What are the good things about it? What are the bad things? And how does this connect? What does the research say about social media and suicide? So that was one of my big takeaways.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about that, because we got a really important piece of feedback very early in the conference. One of the conference organizers sort of came and said, are you open to feedback? And speaking of, am I open to feedback? I'm getting some. So whose mic is it?
Who is feeding back? Is it me?
I don't know. No, it's Bart.
No, I think it's Bart.
I don't know what Bart. Thank you, Bart.
Is it doing it now?
No, it stopped when you hit mute. I don't know. Man, I can't say, man. And you're even wearing a headset. I don't know. So someone came up to us and they said, there are people who've come here and they've come here specifically to learn how social media is causing suicide. And of course that has never, there's no good evidence of that. And that's just really a very unfortunate headline that isn't well supported by data at all. And the opposite, of course, is true. And so for whatever reason, we had audience members that were sort of there to hear a message, in fact, that we couldn't credibly or honestly deliver, right? Which was sort of an interesting deal, but it was a really great opportunity to talk about the issue. And we never did hear. And I'm really curious from your point of view, Bart. Like, what do you think how do you think the audience took it? And maybe Tony might also weigh in when we did start talking about the fact that we don't have evidence for this.
Well, I think that the audience is really curious about it. I think that it ties into something that you hit on really well in your presentations. There's a tremendous amount of fear about new technologies and about the world changing. And I think that we are really quick to grab onto these really big, obvious things that are happening in our culture as the cause for these other bad things that are happening at the same time. Right. And so I think that one of the things that's really clear to me is that social media is one of these things that here was a shocker when we would ask how many people are on Twitter, how many people are on Reddit, right? The numbers were really unbelievably low. I'm guessing Facebook was pretty popular. There were a lot of folks that were on Facebook, right? But you have a group of folks that are not particularly social media. There were some Instagram.
What, Tony? What'd you say, Tony?
He said there were a lot of the attendees were on Instagram.
Yeah.
But we should say that the conference skewed female by, I don't know, 90%.
Easily, yeah. Except for Mitch, who totally got the Douglas Adams reference. Anyway, go ahead, Bart.
So you have here's what you've got. You've got a group of folks that are not particularly social media savvy, but who are consuming at a surface level the snippets of information about how horrible and dangerous social media is. And it really, one of the things that really dawned on me is how much of the role the media plays in stoking our fears. And so when the media finds a story that garners a lot of attention, they really push it. And the social media. I'm gonna cut out.
Now come back. Now unmute it. See if it goes away.
Is it there?
It's bad. It's better. Yeah. Go ahead. Try again.
So if I talk too much, it happens?
I think you talk too loud. I think it's like when your volume goes up, when your intensity goes up.
If I talk really quiet, does it happen?
I don't know. Could you use your quiet voices?
Can you hear me when I talk like that?
Yeah, you sound great.
So I'll try. This is weird. I have a big. So
can you put your face like really close to the and just talk?
What I was trying to say was that the media sucks. So what I'm trying to say quietly is that there's a lot of information out there that's fear-based and fear-driven. And I think that this is something that people, parents and mental health professionals respond to at a really intense level because here's some simple solutions. If the suicide rate's going up, let's focus on social media, keeping kids' screen time down, and bullying. We actually had quite an exchange with an alleged mental health expert, a PhD level person that doesn't understand the difference between causation and correlation that went on for actually about 24 hours after the conference, very upset about the comment that bullying doesn't cause suicide.
Which we want to talk about some more, I think, because that's really interesting. And I haven't heard all of the follow-up from that. You were sort of mentioning that feedback as you were running out the door to the airport.
So it's one of those things where people just don't really understand the term causation very well. That's part of the problem. And when you have a PhD and you don't understand causation, I have serious questions about how you got your PhD. Is part of what I'm saying. And I think what ends up happening is that when you say that bullying doesn't cause suicide, what people hear is that you don't think that bullying is important or an issue that we need to address, right? And I think that this is often the level of discourse I think that we have to a large extent. When you confront people with information that's factual in nature, if it doesn't fit their emotional narrative, it can create some challenges for them. And this person, even despite having numerous articles presented to them, in the end, still just couldn't quite grasp what exactly was being said to them. And they're an alleged mental health expert with a PhD in a big elite city. Where
now we were so grateful that they came and were a participant.
Oh no, they weren't a participant.
And then they were engaged in the conversation.
They were engaged in the conversation. Yes.
But
that's one way that you could describe it.
So like, let's unpack. This is my new phrase. This is my new phrase from Queer Eye. So that's a lot to unpack. Let's talk about that. So we were up and presenting just a lot of content at the conference, and there were some recent suicides in their community of youth. And by the way, because people do die by suicide, that when you go and speak in a metropolitan area, that a youth might have recently died by suicide is pretty, I want to say common, but that seems like that happens almost everywhere I go. How about you, Bart?
How about, let's watch another thread. What's the question?
Like that when you go to speak somewhere, that it's almost always the case that there's been a recent youth death by suicide that's on the community's minds?
It is really rare that I go anywhere and talk about suicide where there isn't a recent death that has impacted the community. And it's youth deaths impact the community at a much higher level. And I think one of the challenges around that is for every one of those youth deaths, there's probably 10 to 15 adults that have died in that same period of time in that community. That nobody even is aware of or talking about, right?
Right.
So for lots of different reasons, youth suicide gets magnified at a tremendous level, and people it resonates with people a lot more, and you'll see that people are more they're more spooked by it, right? It's something that has a larger emotional impact.
So that was something that was on folks' mind, and we had a lot of participants who wanted to talk about youth-related topics. And I will tell you, like, if you guys remember when, like, back in October, I said, when I was calendaring ideas for what we're going to be covering for this season, one of them, we did, of course, back-to-back episodes on youth items related to sort of appropriate social media use and sort of social use and parenting, and then one on sort of school surveillance and monitoring, because those were questions I was getting a lot. And then you and Tony were present for when we were getting just a ton of youth questions. Like that I would say that was, that was probably 60% of the questions we got, right, Bart?
There was a tremendous amount of interest about youth and social media, and how do both from a mental health standpoint as providers and as parents, how do we address this new aspect of living? Digital living is something that is here to stay. People are going to be living larger and larger portions of their lives digitally. And I think that that's frightening to people, and they're not quite sure. And if you stop and think about it, there isn't a whole lot of really good support out there for clinicians or parents about what to do and how to have these conversations with their kids, and what are the different approaches that you can take, and what are the pros and cons of the different approaches that you can take. You and I have very different strategies around youth and social media, right?
I would say we have different parenting strategies.
We do.
Right?
We do.
But like when we talk about sort of like general population stuff, I don't know that we disagree, but I would definitely say we're different people and parent different kids. So we just have different parenting strategies. But that was fun. Like we did a whole section on we'll disagree, and then we agreed a lot. Like I don't know how that happened. But that was sort of one of the things that I wanted to make everyone aware of, is that it looks as if the large majority of media about suicide and social media and technology is about how it is causing suicide, kind of like rock and roll music is causing suicide, or Dungeons and Dragons is causing suicide. Now it is the smartphones and the social media that is causing suicide. And there's this really strong narrative. And so folks are coming to these conferences very, very cued by a non-expert media narrative for us to tell the same story, because there's something about the way that they're reading it that they think that that experts are the genesis of that story.
It is, and what's really interesting, there's a reporter there, and who was a very dear person, very much wanted more information about this. What was interesting in that process was that they trying to answer the question, why is the suicide rate up? Why is the suicide rate up among youth?
Mm-hmm.
And the hard answer is that we don't know exactly. We've got guesses. We have some things that we feel more strongly about than others. But one of the things that's been, I think, quite humbling to me as I've learned more about suicide in general over the last 20 years, there's more about suicide that we simply don't understand than we do understand, particularly population elements of suicide, why suicide rates go up and down in different cultures, why there's a cycle to it. If you look at the United States of America, there's a clear up and down pattern that's been going on since we've been tracking suicide rates. What drives this up and down? What drives the variability in these population suicide rates? People have lots of theories, but nobody has really good definitive answers about it, right? And I think that is also troubling for folks.
And I don't know that we have really good media about that. Like, here's all the stuff you think we know about suicide that we really don't know, because this research has not been funded and supported in a really strong, systematic way. And that is there. It's not that people don't want to know. It is hard to get research dollars. There are not, it is hard to get IRB approval. I think that's even harder than getting research dollars. And people don't realize that. So when you say, so they really think we know, that's like that, you know, and I wish that we had a better strategy for saying, we don't know, and we could know, but there's some things getting in the way of us having the answers you think we already have. And that was like, that's like one of those talking points that I feel like we want to say, like, have you lost someone to suicide? Much like when we were losing people to AIDS and HIV in the 1980s, or complications from those things. There was a lot we did not know, and we were losing people due to lack of research, lack of understanding, lack of effective treatment. And that's, I think, happening today. We spend 5 times the amount of research dollars on HIV that we do on suicide. So of course, when we spend at different scales, you have different levels and different speeds of progress. And people think that we really know why people kill themselves. Then what was really interesting and is that then people talk about bullying. You were mentioning this earlier, and I want to circle back to that. People are tweeting about it right now. Like when we were, you know, talking about that, everyone feels they know why people kill themselves. Like, and even as I was driving in, my Uber driver was like, well, people kill themselves. Kids are killing themselves because social media or because bullying. And we're like, social media is everywhere, but many kids are using it and not dying. Bullying is very common. It's a very common, not helpful, very common derogatory, illness promoting youth experience that only rarely ends in suicide. And we don't know why it sometimes does and why it often doesn't. And that's a really good question.
I think we should interject something we've discussed on previous shows. And that is that whenever something comes up in the media that, especially when a shocking event happens related to children and families, and there is no clear explanation. What?
There was just a funny sound. Keep going.
Oh, okay. People go every which way trying to explain it. So rock music was the devil's music. Devil worship was causing teenagers to act badly and sacrifice cats in the 80s. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, we even
happened every consistently.
Yeah. Travis Atkinson's tweeting, suicide rate is up with youth. So suicide rate is up with youth. And then the answer is possibly because.
Right.
And then it's listing things that happen really generally, even though suicide is very, very specific. So we have more to feel bad about for ourselves than ever before. Perceived deficiencies that drive the economy, as well as substance abuse and addiction. Well, those are social trends that are happening, that are negative, that are mental illness promoting. And they're happening on a really large scale, but suicide's happening on a very different scale. So we don't know why, for example, like, perceived failures as causing suicide in some people and not in others. And that is like the real question, I think, right, Bart? Or Chris?
It's really complicated.
Go ahead, Bart.
So it gets really complicated with Travis's tweet. What's interesting about Travis's tweet is that, in fact, the trends are the exact opposite. Teen drug use is actually down. Teen premarital sex is down. Teen
Maybe
drinking.
They have more sex.
So there's these really interesting trends, but teen depression, anxiety, and suicide are up. So we have these really puzzling population health trends that don't give us really easy answers, because there really aren't really easy answers for these questions, right? The economy, to a large extent, is a large factor. We learned it at the AAS conference, not conference, but at AAS Strategic Planning. The myth that's been passed around that the drop in young female suicide in China was due to means restriction, right? In various degrees, we've all heard versions of this.
That was farmer suicide in China.
And then it turned out that, in fact, that the evidence doesn't show that in fact they don't believe it had anything to do with reduction in means, that the program was never fully implemented. It never did what they thought it was going to do. Yeah. So even things that we think we know the answer to, it turns out when people look at it, that's not really the answer. So,
yeah.
What do you do with that?
Travis has tweeted a follow-up. He says, any comparative rates to indigenous isolated tribes of suicide, such as Native American, Amish, or other removed communities? Do we need to just go back to living in tribes of approximately 150 people and unplug? And Bart did do a whole presentation on the importance of tribe. But what I'm going to tell you is that social media has only been around for a few years. Suicide's been around as long as we know. And so we could unplug, but before we had plugs, we had suicide.
What I can tell you is that all-cause mortality, in the last 100 years has been cut in half. So that means half the people die at any given rate than did 100 years ago. So, little tribes is a great idea. There's some parts of that concept that I like, but I don't like giving up the germ theory of disease. I think I'd really prefer to have antibiotics. And the only reason, what I'm saying is in a coy manner, is that
coy is the word for tonight.
Is that
KOI?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that there's a fish. You've heard of a fish joke, people. That was a fish joke. Those don't happen very often, so I'm just going to mark that. Okay, what I'm saying is. Okay,
good call,
where's the
guys.
show going? It's all fish all the time. I guess we could do an aquarium show.
You like germ theory.
Outdoor
You're
aquarium.
not trying to be coy. You like germ theory.
No, what I'm trying to tell you, what I'm trying to say is that the only reason that suicide is a blip on the public health radar is that a whole bunch of other public health problems are solved for the Western world. Typhoid, not such a big problem, right? Dysentery, not killing millions of people in the United States. Now, worldwide it is, but not in the United States. Mm-hmm. Not in the Western world.
Very true, Tony. The reason why that suicide is the leading killer of young women worldwide is not because the suicide rate is up worldwide. The suicide rate is not up worldwide. I don't believe, not in a significant fashion. It's up in some cultures. It's down in other cultures. Mm-hmm. The reasons that young women are dying have changed dramatically. They're not dying from other causes like they used to. We see the same thing with our own suicide rate. The cause of death, suicide's cause of death has increased. The rates increased as well, but the number of deaths for other reasons, particularly this is something people that traffic fatality deaths are way down, which used to be a big killer of young folks as well. Those fatalities down. This is something we don't talk about. The homicide rate across the country has dropped dramatically in the last 10, 15 years. It's up in a few cities, but nationwide, the homicide rate is reducing and continues to drop. There's obviously pockets of increase, but still on the whole, it continues to drop. So there's lots of noise in the background. Yes, Chris, jump in.
No, just that you reminded me of something that came out a couple years ago. Steven Pinker was looking at some numbers about how peaceful the world is. And we are at a much more dramatically lower level of serious armed conflict. So even the number of people dying in wars is down dramatically. So, but we still see all these headlines about these terrible atrocities and these things that are happening. So we get the impression that this shit's really bad, when in reality the numbers are substantially lower than they ever have been.
Is that because if it bleeds, it leads? Is that why?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to read a tweet from Jess Stolman-Ramey, who was there, by the way. Jess, it was so awesome to see you and Heidi and the whole gang. You're so amazing. Jess tweets, I think it is hard to challenge the myths about things like bullying because we don't have a singular other cause to point to. People's emotional need to have something to blame or just to have an explanation outweighs the desire to really understand what's happening. And I would say, like, I think everyone really does desire to understand what's happening. It is really hard to say we don't know really why. We know we know that when someone dies by suicide, it is not their feelings that kill them. It is something else, right? So when I talk about folks, it's not their emotions that killed them. It was like a bullet or asphyxiation, or it was this thing that killed them. And it was different depending on the death, but it was not actually their feelings that were lethal. And we don't know for sure why people have those feelings. And we know that when those feelings pop up, that it's in rare cases that they can do something with lethal means. And when you start to say that, it like people don't know what to do with that. I feel like that's a really that's an explanation that comes out of my mouth that I don't know that it works very well. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. In an abstract way, it makes a ton of sense. People are looking for concrete answers, and I think Jess really hits the nail on the head. And this, what's really interesting, what we saw in processing this with the folks, the participants at the conference, is what you see with people who've just suffered the loss of someone to suicide. They really want to understand why this happened. And in fact, a part of a good therapy around this is helping them understand that they don't need to know why, and what they might never know why. And that's part of the healing process, is acknowledging that there's many unknowns in why your loved one died this way, right? Even when there are notes in existence, the notes don't necessarily really tell us why the person died of suicide. They give us some clues, but it doesn't really give us the why. Right? Why then? Why now? Right? And so people want really concrete answers to these questions that don't have simple answers. Human behavior, and it's really hard. And I've got to really work on a better way to describe this. Human behavior is not explained in reductionist terms. We can't break down human behavior into these very simple, clear parts and say this is why X happened because of Y. That's just not how human behavior works for the most part.
This is a really easy metaphor, but have you ever asked your kids why they did something? Like, human beings are bad explainers about why they did something. Like even if you tell a story about why you did something, we have a ton of research that shows that we can do all sorts of things that influence people's behavior that they're completely unaware of, and they'll offer you an explanation of why they did something that doesn't fit, when you did something to the environment and really strongly, and very strongly nudge them. Like, we know that people don't understand the why of their own behavior nearly as well as you'd think, and that's not always the best way to understand or predict human behavior. But we still have with suicide a lot of narratives about why people die of suicide that are really more narratives of why people feel bad. Does that make sense?
I think that's an important point. And I think that one of the things that we know about human consciousness is that a good chunk of the things that we think are thinking are explaining things that we don't even understand why we did them in any way, shape, or form. A lot of our behaviors are not things that we understand really well. And so, but one of the jobs of our consciousness is to come up with a narrative that makes some sense, particularly a socially desirable narrative, or a narrative that fits in some structure or some explanation that other people can make sense of, right? So it's more of a social phenomenon than explaining an internal mechanism, right? And that's an incredibly big thing to wrap your mind around, and that makes it hard to understand. And I think Tony's talked about this. We may be able to alter the suicide rate without actually understanding what's actually causing the underlying suicides in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Good means restriction, in fact, is one of those things that doesn't really tell us about what's driving the suicide desire, but has a pretty good impact on suicide rates. Doesn't really explain why people are so intent on killing themselves, or what's driving that, and the pain that's driving that, and the social constructs that are driving it. But we know that we can reduce it just by ensuring that people don't have ready access to ways to kill themselves very easily.
So
I think that
we're having this conversation about sort of like the meat and cheese of suicidology sandwich, right? I want to contrast my Uber driver away from the airport to my Uber driver to the airport, his name was Damien, and I'm still not sure how, I feel like I didn't get a real beat on what he does and who he was. But so the first one said, it's the social media that's causing kids to kill themselves, right? And as I'm going back away from the airport and they ask you why you're in town, I always will say, if I'm directly asked, I won't be coy about it. Coy fish. And this was the first time I ever had an Uber driver do this. And Damien, if you're out there, you're weird, and I want to meet you again. And he said, suicide's a really common public health problem. He goes, don't something like 2 or 3 people a day die by per state die by suicide? It's like a little bit over 100, right? And it's more common than traffic accidents. And he said, and isn't it more common even than HIV, if I recall the statistics for that, right? And he just rattles this off. And I thought, who are you, Damien? Somewhere, some statistics and some media got to Damien that did not get to Trevor, my other Uber driver. And I can't figure that out. How did we get this much more accurate message to one and not the other?
Damien's pretty impressive. Wow, that was quite that was quite the Uber ride. But did you get a water? Did you get a free water from him?
He gave me the limo experience. So there was this whole seating and TV and he was like, I'm giving you the limo experience with a minivan, and offered me things. It was also 4:30 in the morning. I don't remember a lot. I may have been
no water.
What?
Okay. No water. Did you get a water?
Who drinks water at 4:30 in the morning?
Human beings do all the time. I actually imagine there's lots of people drinking water at 4:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
Any time is the right time to hydrate.
Chris is waiting to do that GIF.
Which one? No. Okay, there we go. I needed a couple. So your question about how do we get really important and accurate information to one person, and how does it fail someone else? I think it just comes down to interacting with all of the possible audiences that we can, or creating some sort of message that just resonates with humans in particular. But regardless, it has to be super digestible. It has to be really easy and really short for people to understand. But media professionals don't make that kind of content. And the people that typically read the New York Times religiously, they aren't seeing the same things that people who do get it are. They're not seeing those same little videos on Facebook that just kind of throw some statistics at you in an engaging way. They're not watching us. And so how do we go and target those people? By interacting with those media professionals. And I think
Ramey says, we, the suicide prevention community, don't directly say that we don't know. It's complicated for us to say because it makes us vulnerable. Jess, I said to a reporter that we don't know. She wasn't satisfied, so I handed her to Bart.
Exactly.
Because I tried to say it, and she was like, I can't pitch that.
We want certainty about things where there is no certainty. And in fact, if people realized how much uncertainty there is, and I'll give you a great example. We think we don't understand suicide really well. Lots of women go and get mammograms all the time, right? So people believe that there's a science to reading mammograms. I've got bad news for everybody out there. There is no science to reading mammograms. There's only 1% of things where the radiologist can say this is cancer and this is not cancer. The other 99% is all freaking guesswork, ladies and gentlemen, and different radiologists have different approaches to how they make those guesses. The doctors that diagnose the most cancers also have the highest false positive rate. So there's lots of women going and getting biopsies that don't need biopsies.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about for a minute.
So we hold off. This is always an issue. Wait a minute, Tony and Chris and I agreed that boob talk was going to be limited to the end of the show and at 5 minutes max.
I never agreed to that.
I went to the doctor for an urgent medical concern last April. And they really wanted to give me a mammogram. And I mean, they were just hard as a rock for giving me a mammogram. And I walked in I made the appointment on the phone because I needed an urgent appointment for an entirely different healthcare matter. And they said, okay, and can we schedule your mammogram? And I said, there are conflicting medical guidelines. There are no lumps. I do my breast self-exam. I actually need an urgent appointment for something else. She goes, but your insurance covers it. Just have a mammogram. And I said, I don't really need the radiation. I don't really need to, I have this actual thing that's a real problem that I need attention for. And they're like, are you sure? And so I had to have a 5-minute before I could schedule my other healthcare appointment. Then I show up at the desk. They want to give me a fucking mammogram. And these are just office support staff, and they tried to give me a mammogram. Then I went into the room, and they wanted to give me a mammogram again. The nurse filling out my thing, and I said, nope, I'm here for another thing. Then the doctor came in, and the doctor says to me, so you're the person who has a problem with mammograms. And this was for me to get a routine healthcare appointment. Why do you think, Bart, they want to give a mammogram? They understand a mammogram. They can bill for a mammogram, all that stuff. We understand some things about suicide, we don't. And so we pick the things that we understand and we just hammer those topics because like every part of the system knew what to do about my boobs. And they were very uninterested in the actual thing that needed attention that was a little bit more mysterious. And I feel like there's this thing about suicidality where we're trying to do an intervention and we're hammering. So someone's died by suicide. So we're going to do an anti-bullying rally, which is great. Like, believe me, I have had friends who've survived breast cancer. I'm glad for mammograms and good breast cancer treatment. I have walked and I've donated money, and that's great. But for some reason, my problem wasn't even here, and that's all the doctor could talk about. And I think the same thing happens with bullying and other stuff in suicide.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
To everybody. Okay, so do we?
That's rude.
No. So when we look at what we know, do we know? And Tony and I have talked about this at length. Do we know much more about what causes an attempt versus what actually causes someone to kill themselves? And I'm separating those very distinctly. And secondly, are we missing an opportunity to present information to people in a much stronger way if we focus on the numbers that come with attempts, because those are in the millions, right?
We've got some data. The research tells us some interesting things. Some that are not particularly surprising. The lethality of means, to a large extent, indicates the likelihood of death following an attempt, right? Firearms, just plain and simple, are just more effective at killing people. And so the number of people, the percentage of people who die following an attempt with a firearm is incredibly astronomically higher than just about any other attempt method. We also know that attempts in younger folks are less likely to be lethal. And there's lots of reasons for that. We know that folks that are older, their attempts are more likely to end up in death. That older folks don't have multiple attempts. Often it's a single attempt and they end up dead. So we have a general sense that there are these patterns that although obviously some youth do die from suicide attempts, youth are much more likely to have multiple suicide attempts that are non-lethal. Older adults are less likely to have multiple attempts, more likely to have lethal attempts, and we know that plain and simple that firearms are incredibly lethal. And so Dr. Sean Joe at WashU did some really good research around this. Having a firearm in the home does not increase the presence or the frequency of suicide thoughts or suicide attempts. It just impacts the lethality of those attempts, right? So it doesn't actually produce suicide thoughts. It's not a variable around the likelihood to have thoughts or attempt. But if you do attempt and there's a firearm in the home, people are more likely to die because they're more likely to use a firearm to do it.
And this is not for some mysterious psychological reason. That's because a gun is a machine that is designed to kill things, and it does a really good job at killing things.
And
right? I mean, there's no mystery.
Let's be clear that we understand how a gun will end a life. We understand a lot about various traumatic injuries, and if you use a gun in different ways, how you could die. We know a lot about that medically. What we don't understand is why someone has a suicidal thought, when it happens, and what causes it. We really just don't know. And we really should know. We really do need to research that. Like, and we need to be investing real dollars and have really large scale research programs on that. And we don't have it. And there are people who want to do it. Like, should that want to be a funded thing? It's just, that's just not something we've had the political will to fund as a nation.
Yeah, it is. And one of the interesting, when we were having a discussion on Twitter about bullying causing suicide, there was one of the studies had a really interesting outcome that nobody anticipated. They found, and this is really, when you think about it, mind-blowing. They found that bullying behaviors, being the victim of bullying behaviors, was not associated with suicide attempts. But what was associated with it in the same population was endorsing the statement, "I am being bullied." Right? So let me separate this out. This is really powerful. The actual behaviors, specific behaviors and incidents of bullying were not, in fact, associated with an increased risk. But people who endorsed the statement, "I'm being bullied," it did increase the risk, right? The coefficient, the risk coefficient went up. So this mindset that I'm a victim of bullying, regardless of whether the person is being bullied or not, by the way, was more predictive of suicide than actual being the victim of specific bullying behaviors. That's really interesting stuff to me. Now you're making a face. What's your face about?
I'm going to add on the bullying stuff, like for the literature on bullying, that we really do understand that not all people are sort of equal opportunity targets for being bullied, and that there are people who are targeted for bullying that have things going on that would make them vulnerable for suicide attempts or deaths. I think that they already have pre-existing issues. So there might be oppression, so there might be differences that society is very rejecting, like social behaviors that often get them targeted because their peers find them annoying or painful or unpleasant in some way. So they could have all sorts of other issues that are causing these social behaviors that lead to peer rejection. There are things like that. And we have an overlap there's a fairly significant overlap between people who bully and then go on to bully others. And so like bullying is a complex behavior, but like there's something that's seemed to happen. Like if the peers are mean, they will just kill themselves. And there's no evidence for that.
Not in the classic sense of scientific evidence. You are correct, but it feels that way. And I will add that this is one of the things that I'm very concerned about.
The artisan sense of science.
I will say that, yes, one of the things that I'm very concerned about in our culture at this point in time is that when people feel a certain way, it must be that way regardless of what the evidence or the science says. And this is problematic because when presented with facts or science, then people are really get worked up because you're not endorsing, embracing their narrative that they feel very strongly about. And it's really hard to have reasonable conversation.
Right, Bart? You had a 24-hour engagement.
It's really hard to have reasonable conversations with people when they feel something strongly. There's a tendency that facts don't get in the way of these I really do believe X, Y, and Z. And that's why we have actually science, because we know that that's just not a good way to understand the world. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm open to being wrong about that.
Marshall tweeted, Marshman503, we know the how of suicide, but not the why. And we need, all caps, to know the why. We do spend a lot of time reporting how many and how. We do have numbers for that.
Well, I don't know that we need to. I think we want to, but I think that we can prevent. I think we can prevent suicide, death by suicide. We can prevent attempts without knowing why. So I wouldn't call it a need. I mean, though I love Marsh. Marsh is a great guy. I don't think we need to. I think we'd like to, but I don't think we need to.
So Tony, is what you're saying, so if we can find some sort of program or initiative that lowers actual numbers of deaths or attempts, but we still don't understand exactly how it works, that's okay.
It's like most of medical,
because that's what we're trying to focus on.
Now, admittedly, that's being a pretty big jerk. Like, I'm ignoring a lot of things about like very well studied procedures that have worked thousands of times. And so like I'm saying, oh, well, we don't really understand them. Well, that's a bit of I'm glossing over a lot of stuff. So like I know that, everybody. But what I am saying is that, yeah, like we can do interventions. We can do nicely controlled experiments on potential interventions without
endangering anybody. It's not. It's something we have the power to do if we chose to do it.
We're only a few minutes until final thoughts. Do we want to do a follow-up on this? Chris had like a couple of media things he wanted to review, and then somebody asked about firearms because it's been in the news all week. And so I wonder if we can touch like 2 items really quickly because it's been in the thread.
Okay.
So one, Chris, we're going to be reviewing and talking about this. You just shared with us a video right before chat.
Yeah, and I'm going to tweet it out right now too. But so one of our favorite YouTube groups, Funhouse, have found a game called Suicide Guy. And I guess the whole point of the game is to go through levels and find ways to kill yourself. It's a puzzle-based game, but suicide is the mechanic. Or the mechanism. So interesting. But they address it in a very interesting way and in a relatively responsible way. I mean, they're a comedy group. Their stuff is usually funny, but they took it, and the video begins with information on how to reach supports in the Lifeline. They talk multiple times during making jokes. They say, but seriously, if you're ever feeling down, or if you're ever feeling depressed, or feeling like you're going to kill yourself, reach out, find support, that kind of stuff. They get serious. So they've mashed laughing about this really shitty game where suicide is the mechanism with serious supports. So it's just an interesting, not what we're used to seeing.
We haven't had a chance to really read and dive in, but we're going to go look at some of this stuff. I think we'll have maybe some more commentary after we've seen it. Bart?
Well, I think that I can't wait to watch the video that Chris is talking about, but I see this on dank memes a lot, right? Mm-hmm. And we see this on Reddit. When we make it not okay for people to talk about suicide the way they want to talk about suicide, all we do is push away people that we really want to reach into corners where they make up their own rules and have their own culture around how they're going to talk about suicide.
Right? At Elevate the Convo.
We did get to talk about it, and it's really interesting to me. And when you first get exposed to, particularly some of the cultures on Reddit that I'm more familiar with now, it can, as a mental health professional, it can be a little freaky. But then you start to realize that, in fact, there's actually support and healing, and there is pain relief going on in this process. The way people cope with their pain isn't always the ways that we want to see them, or that people are comfortable with how people cope with their pain. But when people are getting relief in these communities, even though they talk about suicide in very dark ways, and often what some people would consider quite funny ways, there's a whole bunch of ass clenching going on among mental health professionals about folks talking about suicide this way. I think that's problematic for me. We really need to be able to connect with people, and people need to be able to express themselves the way they want to, and have conversations in the way they want to have them. And we need to find a way to be able to interact and engage them. And this game sounds like a rather creative way to do that. At the same time, part of me is like, oh my God, the goal of the game is to kill yourself, and that's kind of freaking me out, right? So I think that's just the kind of way that things are.
We're going to have to look at that, and because I'm excited to maybe flesh out some of our response that after we've had a chance to reflect. We might do a show about that, I think, because that's really interesting. And I'm a fan of dark humor to cope. We had one more thing to comment on. Marshman asked if SPSM was going to touch the gun topic, and first of all, I think that we have. So that was. So the issue about guns and murder-suicide is in the media again. And it was just in the media. I mean, it seems like it's in the media now all the time related to these murder-suicide shootings. And then the question is SPSM going to touch this? So we have talked about doing media and messaging with the firearm community, and we had Elaine Frank on, and I do want to refer you guys to that SPSM check, because I thought that was great. We also talked about like securing a firearm, and I brought an AR-15 on the show for you all. So I was at a loss in terms of the sort of the mission of SPSM, what there was new to say about it. But Marshman, you are totally correct. And for several of you who are on the AS listserv, there's been a lot of intense conversation about the issue of firearms and suicide in media and messaging. Does anyone want to comment on that? Back to Marshman.
Well, I think that it's something that we need to have more conversations about. I think just like we're talking about suicide in general, there is no one clear, easy answer to these questions. There's not one solution in this country that's going to solve this particular dilemma that we have for many different reasons. And I think one of the things that's really interesting to me is that we act like all of these mass shootings are singular events and all share the exact same things, and they're not. And the reasons they happen are often very specific to that person and that context. In the most recent event, this was a fully preventable death. In fact, the system, if it would work the way the system should have worked, these deaths never would have happened. There were many opportunities for the community and law enforcement to prevent this from happening. And those things didn't work the way they were supposed to. That isn't always the case with some of these. This is one where really there was lots of chances to make sure that this kid didn't have guns and got appropriate care. And at every single opportunity, it fell through. It even fell through in securing the scene. With law enforcement on scene, that they didn't do the job that they should have done. There's just so many things with this one that are very specific and unique to it. And there's differences with other events, right? There isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution to these problems.
Chris or Tony?
Oh, Chris.
It's a complex situation.
And we're not,
but what I will say,
we're not dodging it.
What I will say is that and what we've actually started seeing is some of these larger national organizations coming out with ways to address it. I think that'll continue to happen, and we can continue to have conversations on what seems to be working and what can be done better. I think in line with the SPSM manifesto, is multidisciplinary collaboration is super important. I think one of the ways that we can have the most impact with firearms and suicide is collaborating with people who are gun owners, who are gun manufacturers. If we can find ways to include mutually beneficial messaging and information, I think that's where we could actually see some effective things happening.
Tony Wood.
I don't know. It's 11 o'clock, everybody.
I know it is.
We heard enough out of me, haven't you?
Final thoughts. Let's go ahead. Final thoughts. Bart.
Final thoughts, the comments on the thread, there's been so many amazing comments. I can't tell you how much I love this community and getting to have these conversations with you all on Sunday evenings. So just big love to everybody. And let's keep this conversation going, because I think this is one of the places where we really have meaningful conversations and the things like at the conference, we talked about things I bet those folks never get exposed to in a meaningful way on a regular basis. And I think we're a little privileged here to have these conversations every week. It's very cool.
Yeah, super cool. Chris Maxwell.
I'm going to read John Ackerman's tweet as my final thought, because I like the word that he used. Concept of equifinality is key in understanding suicide. Many different pathways or risk factors can result in the same negative outcome. Bullying is only one risk factor for youth suicide. As with most things, interactions are more meaningful, but hard to get into sound bites. Nailed it.
Awesome. Tony Wood, final thoughts.
Experiment. Fail, learn, repeat. We can prevent this.
Ooh.
Bart and Chris came out. I'm going to say final thoughts where it's really, really great that we were invited to Denver. Thank you so much for having us and for spending 6 hours with us. My final thoughts on Elevate the Convo were that people have a lot of questions and want answers exactly for the very specialty content that only SPSM has provided in one place, as far as I know. So it lets us know that there's a public hunger, and now I've got some thinking to do of how you distribute this content in a different way, which we're working on. We will see you next week. We're wrapping up. It's been another hour. Thank you for being with us, everybody. Follow hashtag SPSM. We're going to have the sizzle reel, the curation, all sorts of stuff, and we'll see you soon.
Peace out.
Bye.